You've just done a pre-lecture assessment on Cotto. Let's see how you did through this lecture. In Cotto, we have a revenge act of arson. We've got violence between two groups of people, leaves people dead in the streets, and now defendants decide to commit arson of an apartment. How are they going to do that? Their plan was to throw in a plastic bottle filled with fuel to burn the apartment down. That was the intent. So we have a crime of arson here. No need to have the entire apartment burned down. Any singeing of the walls will work. And here the court explains the effect of the burning. We've got an arson. Now the question is, do we have an added crime called burglary? Do we also have the charge of burglary? We learned through the opinion that in Massachusetts, both a breaking and an entry is required for the actus reus of burglary. The court says it, and we also know that we have to have it because the defendant keeps talking about breaking as an element. Well, do we have a breaking here? It appears from the testimony of a resident in the apartment that she heard her living room window break. She doesn't know how it broke, but her testimony of seeing the vandals outside the home makes us conclude that this group broke the window. So we know they broke the window. They moved the structural impediment by throwing something in that broke the window. Next comes whether the defendants entered the house. This is more problematic. After all, they never actually entered the apartment, and we know any full body or part of the body entering will work. The question comes down to whether we can have an entry in a different way. It's what we call in the law an entry by instrumentality. That's a term of art, entry by instrumentality. It doesn't just mean an entry by an object. Rather, the key is whether the object or the instrumentality has entered to commit the felony in lieu of the defendant. Is the defendant's plan that that object or instrumentality enter in order to do the defendant's bidding? Then it's an extension of defendant's mens rea, an extension of defendant's will, and it will satisfy the element. Here, the plastic bottle filled with fuel enters the apartment with exactly that purpose. It's entering to commit the felony of arson. Defendants didn't enter physically. They didn't enter the apartment and strike a match and light the apartment. The plastic bottle went in instead, and by that extension, it supplied the entry for the defendants. It showed their felonious intent. That's exactly the kind of instrumentality we're looking for. What we don't want to use are objects or instruments that are only used to commit more breakings. So if a rock were thrown through that living room window to break it, yeah, it's an object. Yes, it entered. But that's not what entry by instrumentality means. So let's look at the facts here. The facts support the rule on entry by instrumentality. Still, something was amiss at trial, and here comes the procedural issue. The trial court's instruction wasn't quite as complete as it should have been. It didn't follow through to explain the limitation on entry by instrumentality. It didn't spell out the rule that the instrument has to enter in order to commit the felony. But look at what the court concluded. The court said, no big deal. The mistake was harmless. We actually call this in the law harmless error. So a retrial is not necessary. Everybody knew that it had entered to commit the arson, even if the jury instruction was slightly flawed. Once we've determined the basic rule for entry by instrumentality, the court was faced with an interesting issue. Defendant raised a specific challenge to this rule. He claimed that entry by instrumentality requires that the same instrument must enter and do the breaking. What would that look like? Well, let's suppose a bullet smashes a closed window and enters a house to kill someone on the other side of that window. That would be an entry by instrumentality that also completed the breaking. Same instrumentality, doing both. Here, that bullet would have smashed through the window, creating the opening, and it would have entered with the intent to commit the felony of murder. Same instrumentality, doing both. So the defendant says, in this case, something else broke the window. Perhaps it was a rock. And since the plastic bottle didn't commit the breaking of the living room window, it can't be used to meet the element of entry by instrumentality. Defendant is saying, not only does that instrument have to enter to commit a felony, it should also have to break. The court said, no, you're wrong. There is no requirement that the same instrument have to break and enter. Here the window could have been broken by defendants in a completely different way and still have an entry by instrumentality because the plastic bottle with the fuel would have entered in order to commit the arson.